In this chapter, we handle the file upload from the viewer using dropzone.js. We also connect to the conversion service we built in the first couple of chapters to convert the uploaded cut file. Okay, so let's get right into it. So as mentioned, we'll be using dropzone.js to handle the cut file upload, which has a nice drag and drop UI and tons of features. After downloading the JavaScript and CSS file for dropzone, we create a new folder in the tutorials directory called CSS and JavaScript and just place those two files in there. After that is done, obviously both files also need to be added to csviewer.html, the JavaScript as well as the CSS. So now it's time for a little bit of tedious HTML scaffolding to style the Dropbox area. And I'm going to fast forward through that a little bit. It's basically we need like a div that contains the area where the file should be dropped. You can read more on what to do there in the dropzone.js documentation. Create an outer div first that we place somewhere in the center of the screen, and then an inner div that will actually the area where the files can be dropped into. That area is invisible on startup and will be activated with a button we're going to create in a second. And now for creating that button, we do that right after the content div. Make sure that's on top, and yeah, really not much to it. We leave the onClick empty for now until we have the function to activate it in place. Okay, now we create a new class that will handle essentially everything related to the file upload and the data functionality to pull down the files as well. Let's call it CS Manager Client. And just the basic boilerplate code. There's a constructor in here as well. We leave empty for now. And now let's first create these two static functions that show the upload window, the dropzone upload window. So all we do here is turn on, or make that div visible. So now we are creating a function that gets called as soon as the communicator viewer is basically ready. That's always good practice. In this case, it's a model structure ready callback actually that gets executed as soon as not only the model is loaded or is starting to load, but also the model structure, the model tree is available. This is actually also the function where we create the CS Manager Client object. Now, arguably, all these functions in there should be static because there should really be only one CS Manager client, but I like to keep everything in a nice class structure. We're also initializing dropzone here by giving it that dropzone area that we defined before, as well as the URL where to upload the files to. And important here, this will be the URL of the client server, not the conversion queue server. We also specify a timeout here in case something goes wrong. Next thing to add is a callback that gets executed as soon as a file upload has completed. And what we do in that case is remove that file from dropzone. The default is that it actually stays in that UI, but we really don't need it there anymore. And we need to fix a few minor typos as well. And now in startup.js, that gets called at the very beginning, we are setting up that model structure ready callback in the communicator viewer. And we need to include the CS manager client in csviewer.html. And we need to specify the local server address, which in this case is localhost at 3001. And we also need to specify the actual CS manager client object that we fill in that model structure ready callback. And now that we've written this function to show the dropzone window, we can add it here in the onClick on the button. Okay, let's turn to the server. In here, we're just going to need to include Multer and this UID package. And for Multer, what we're going to do is just copy and paste the code that we wrote in the conversion queue with regard to storing the files. And all we need to do here is replace the name of the upload directory. Everything else can stay the same. And let's quickly create that CS uploads directory as well. So now if we switch back to our web browser, we should see that file upload button. And if we click on it, we should be getting that dropzone window. And now you can drag a cut file on it and you will see it's already getting uploaded. And if we switch back to Visual Studio Code, if everything worked correctly, you should see a new directory in the CS upload directory, including the file we just uploaded. So the idea is that the client also maintains its own database of uploaded files independent of the conversion service. And for that, we need to create a new schema and just copy and paste the schema from the conversion service in here and just essentially replace the name and make the necessary modification. We call it CS files. And instead of conversion state, we have a storage ID. That will be the ID that gets returned from our conversion service, and then we just have a boolean that says if the file is being converted or not. Now we fill in our API. For now it's just file upload again, which will be completely analogous to what we did in the conversion service. And now let's go over to the controller and create this post upload function. That function will look at the file path that has been returned from Multer and essentially extract this temporary ID from it, and then pass it on into a new function that we're gonna be creating in a new module, which will handle the processing of that file. And at the end, we're returning the unique item ID back to the viewer. So let's create this new library module. We call it CS Manager. And in there, we are creating that new process function that takes the item ID and the file name. And then what we're doing in there, we're creating a new database item. And again, this is not the database that we're using for the conversion service, but a completely separate one, only related to this viewing client. And we are storing the file name of the cut file in there, as well as the fact that it's not converted yet, and of course this storage ID that we'll be retrieving from the conversion queue. And at the end, we are calling another function called convert, and that's handling the interaction with the conversion service. We take the ID, the file name, and then the database item itself. So in that function, we are uploading the file we have just received to the conversion service, using essentially the same approach that we used in Postman in the previous chapters. For that, we're using an npm package called form data that allows us to set up a form very similar to how it would be done in the client, or how dropzone is doing it, vacating this read stream. And then we're using another package called fetch to actually perform the post request. And for that, we need the conversion service URI, which we will specify a little bit later. And of course, the API call itself. And after the fetch has returned, hopefully with the ID of the item in the conversion service, we're returning that ID, and we can delete that temporary directory that we created. Okay, and let's not forget to install these new packages, node fetch and form data. And we also need that delete package. And of course, all these packages need to be accessible in this module here. I'm just doing that with a single copy and paste to save a little bit of time on my side. And of course, we need to specify the conversion service URI, and we will pass it in via the configuration file. And so we need the start function as well. And a little typo here in the fetch. Now let's define the configuration setting for the conversion service. And make sure we can call the start function on the CS manager. And finally fix another quick typo. So now we should be ready to go, and we can again click on the file upload button, upload the file. And in this case, to see if everything worked, let's switch back to MongoDB Compass. We should have a new collection called CS files with one file in it with a storage ID, and that storage ID came from our conversion service. Great, everything worked, and let's move on to the next chapter.